anything?
Okay, what I was about to say for your purposes is that I will be referring to a period that begins about 1970 when I was appointed Intergovernmental Relations Director on the staff of Marcel, and it will go through the period of 1976 when I was appointed by Mayor Jackson to be head of the Division of Administrative Services. And I guess that must have been, what, 1973, after he was elected. So that's the period I will basically be referring to, 1970 to 73. That was the Marcel period. And then from 73 to 76 when I was Commissioner of Administrative Services. Most of the time when folks refer to affirmative action and my involvement in it, they're referring to that last period, 1973, 1976, because it was during Mayor Jackson's administration that the Board of Aldermen, now the City Council, passed legislation establishing equal opportunity in business, in contracting. During that period, it was referred to as the Finley, F-I-N-L-E-Y ordinance, because it was sponsored by Morris Finley, who was a member of the Board of Aldermen. My recollection, though, of that legislation was there was not any language in it that really said affirmative action. What it basically was a statement of the mayor's policy and then the board's of city policy that contractors and vendors, companies and individuals seeking to do business with the city of Atlanta would not be discriminated against because of their race or their ethnicity. And of course, in addition to making a policy statement, the legislation provided for a mechanism to get that done. And I believe it did create the Office of Affirmative Action. And that office was called the Office of Contract Compliance. That was for the contracts. There was also an Office of Equal Employment Opportunity, EEO. And both of those offices were placed in the Division of Administrative Services. And the directors of those two offices reported directly to me. But the Finley Ordinance was really the legislation, as I know, that really was the foundation of it. And of course, the program began with an assessment of the level of participation by minority firms in the procurement operation. And when that was done, we learned that less than 0.5% of the procurement for the period that we studied, less than 0.5% of those contracts were awarded to minority firms. Then after that assessment, the next step, of course, was to determine what is the capacity? What is the capacity of minority firms to meet the needs, of the city? And this kind of activity was done by the Office of Contract Compliance, So after that was done, then of course we never established any affirmative action goals. We didn't have numerical goals. And that's what I think the uniqueness was of the city's program in the early 70s. The mayor and the council and the Board of Aldermen basically said, stop the discrimination. So our approach was to develop policies and procedures that did not exclude intentionally or unintentionally. And in order to do that, what you have to do is to have clearly defined procurement policies and procedures. that do not allow for, an example, a lot of arbitrary and discretionary decisions. If the RFP says that we want widgets that have the qualities of A, B, C, and D, then no other factor may be considered during the selection process. And the process has to be conducted by folks who have no financial interest, no interest, whatsoever in the procurement. So actually, I would say that what folks call affirmative action really was simply following good procurement policies and practices. Of course, Bill Lucy, who was once president of AFSCME, once said that affirmative action is what folks used to do to get their uncles and aunts in before blacks were elected to to public office. Well, that simply was not the case. We thought that the best way to eliminate discrimination against blacks and other minorities would be to conduct the procurement operation without bias, and so that's what we did. Now, insofar as and I said I was going to emphasize this, Ms. Young, that one of the reasons that we were successful, however, and we were successful. Our biggest project of success, of course, was the expansion of the airport. We had significant minority participation, and we completed that project on budget and under budget and on schedule. But there were many projects, many smaller projects that I consider to be perhaps even more important, because they gave most minority contractors and vendors were small, less than $1 million. So in terms of their total net worth. So it wasn't a really big contract that, to me, represented our progress in the area. The issue was whether or not a small minority contractor without political connections, but with no assets except the ability to perform and a record of good performance, whether that contractor, could be successful insofar as our purchasing operation was concerned. That was the test to me. But at the point I wanted to make that might be of interest to you is that the only reason this worked, because, the city of Atlanta was the first major city that really got into this business. Everybody else was talking, but to me, your program is measured by the number of dollars that the amount of dollars that minority vendors and contractors received. But the reason it worked in Atlanta is because we had strong political support. Strong support from the mayor, strong support from the Board of Aldermen. Why? Because the voters strongly supported the program, strongly, and had confidence in it. They had confidence in it because they could see results, So, but without that strong policy push, you can't move the bureaucracy to do it. You have to have leaders. We see now, you can't move the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is going to follow whatever they think, is going to preserve their jobs, and they're always counting votes. So if as I look at the cities that have not been successful in this area, I always look at the leaders, and you will find that they have not really made the commitment to do it, because it carries risk. It carries risk. I think that Mayor Jackson probably, on the whole, politically benefited, but I think in terms of his own political career, it was probably not a plus. You know, but of course he developed and maintained, you know, the years after he left office, strong support in the community, black and white. Because this is a community that is, you know, fairness is a good strategy.
Where did that come from? You talk about the emphasis on the small minority vendor being able to participate in the procurement.
It was just really dictated by the facts. You know, when we did the survey, we found out most minority-owned companies were small. But we buy a lot of small stuff. You know, we have automobile repair. We spend thousands of dollars, you know, with our fleets getting them repaired. We have 400 buildings here in Fulton County. Somebody has to clean them. You know, so it doesn't require the $40 or $50 million contract. I mean, you know, that's what everybody sees, you know, but most businesses, white and black, they're small. They're small. I mean, most of our contracts are under $100,000. In fact, our challenge now is to deal with those contracts, those purchase orders under $50,000, you know, where departments have a lot of discretion. We've been a little concerned about what we see there, you know. But in Atlanta, we were talking about those days. During the time that we were involved with the development of this program and the implementation of this program, except for the strong policy position of elected officials, it would not have worked. Because the other point I want to give you, there was strong resistance. Very strong. Now we have a lot of rhetoric in support of it. We did not have the rhetoric. You know, very strong resistance. I commented on how much political support we had from voters and taxpayers, but I failed to mention we had fierce opposition. All you have to do is to go pull the files from the Atlanta Constitution in those days and look at some of the editorials and the cartoons and the attacks that the mayor and his administration were subjected to. When this program began, of course, this always is a little surprising to folks from outside Atlanta who knew that, you know, we had one of the most progressive, you know, newspapers in the country during the 60s and 70s. And so it's always surprising, you know, when they find out that some of the most difficult opposition that we had to this program did come from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And others that we considered to be and had been supportive of the other initiatives we had in this community to eradicate discrimination.
Integrating lunch counters is one thing, but integrating the money is something else.
Pardon me?
I said integrating lunch counters is one thing, but integrating money is something else.
Oh, it was a different deal. It was. But my recollection was there wasn't really a lot of enthusiasm for integrating the lunch counter. I remember when Dr. King came from Montgomery to pastor at Ebenezer, a local black newspaper said, we don't want to have this mess now in Atlanta you had in Montgomery, you know, and that it was the facts and the myth and the facts are a little different about how did the Atlanta business community really respond to the efforts of, I'm not going to get into the civil rights thing, but how did the Atlanta business community really respond to the efforts of Maynard Jackson and others to eradicate discrimination from the city's contracting operation? And I can tell you, you'd be shocked to find out it was not supportive at all. Not supportive. And that was in the days when we were supposed to have had some of the better editors and publishers. Of course, it's been downhill since then, in my opinion.
Well, one of the things that, strikes us is that also the city was fortunate to have somebody with your credentials working on these issues. So could you say a little bit about how you came to be in Atlanta?
Yes, well, actually, I was born in Atlanta. My father was a Methodist minister. Of course, at the time, he was a student at the Gammon Theological Seminary, which is the United Methodist Seminary. So I was born here. Grew up in Texas, and when I graduated from law school, my parents had returned here after being away for many years with his pastoring and being a chaplain in the Army and so on. But when I graduated from law school, they had returned here, and that's how I happened to be in Atlanta. My father was president of one of the seminaries at ITC for 15 years, so I came then. But that's an interesting question you ask about the training and all. All of us were college trained and had graduate training in that first wave. All of us were overqualified. We were shocked. I often tell people we were shocked when we went into city government to learn that there were people who were department heads and division heads, who barely graduates from college. They were not college graduates, and they were good department heads and quite effective. So I think it was a cultural thing for us. My generation was heavily into training. All of us were overtrained. Before I came to the city of Atlanta, I had been at EEOC as a director of a division of investigations and conciliations, because Donald Hollowell, who was the so-called Inc. Fund lawyer, civil rights lawyer for this area, was appointed the first regional director of EEOC. So I went with him because I was in his office as a clerk. So when he was appointed regional director of EEOC, I went with him, and it was during that time that I met Sam Massell. And he indicated that he was interested. He was running for mayor, and he said he was interested in trying to recruit minorities, blacks who were interested in public administration. And he said, if I'm elected, I'm going to call you. And he did. So that's how I, got into government. And so that same year, Maynard was elected vice mayor. And I had the opportunity to work with him as a member of Sam Massell's staff while he was vice mayor. So when he was elected mayor, he asked me to accept his position as Commissioner of Administrative Services, primarily because I had the Title VII experience at EEOC, and he wanted to jump right on equal employment and equal opportunities in contracting. So that's how I got that position. But in fact, all of the blacks who came into government then, Sam Massell was the one that brought the first ones in. Massell was the first one that actually brought blacks in on his staff and as department heads, But all of us had college degrees plus, And I think it was just a cultural thing of our generation. We were all overtrained. Not overtrained, but,
And
it's
you
a big thing,
were you
education.
the only woman? I mean, because it was also unusual to be a woman in those.
I was the first woman to head a division in the city of Atlanta, and that was definitely new in those days. It definitely was. But that was also kind of part of Maynard's thing, too, break down the barriers. Break down the barriers. And yes, I was the first female. And interestingly enough, during the time I was immediately before I was appointed Commissioner of Administrative Services, I was still in the position of Director of Intergovernmental Relations, and Maynard appointed me as lobbyist for the city of Atlanta over to Georgia General Assembly. And everybody laughed. However, Leroy Johnson was senator representing Atlanta, and Ben Brown was one of the members of the House So each morning when I would arrive for my duties at the General Assembly, I would go directly to Leroy's office. He was a master politician, and he would tell me exactly what to do. So I worked for Leroy all day. And at the end of the session, and he would tell me to, just, I'll do the talking, and you just get, I'll take care of it. And I was wearing big afros in those days too, and all that sort of thing, which I didn't see what that, why that would be a problem. But we had an excellent year that year, but it was because, frankly speaking, Leroy Johnson, because Maynard held a big press conference and said, "See, you all laughed when I appointed him to his lobbyist, but you see what we've done." But it was Leroy. It was Leroy. We had different Republicans over there then. We had Republicans like Coverdale, a gentleman, just had a different philosophy of government. And so we didn't have to deal with some of the stuff that they deal with now. We had a different kind of Republican. Yeah.
So Leroy Johnson didn't let what happened in the campaign and all of that, none of that fed over into his professionalism as a senator.
Do I Leroy? No, because these were in the days before his problems, came up. This was like 74, 75. And no, it had no effect on any of the work that I was doing with him or the city, to my knowledge. We did a lot of work to help him. I didn't, but the administration helped him when he brought Muhammad Ali back to the Civic Center, because he got a lot of help from the city on that, because that was good for the city, So, but no, not to my knowledge. I must say that I really was not an insider, though, in the Jackson administration, in the sense that, we always have meetings before the meeting, so I was never in the meeting before the meeting, I was in the cabinet meeting, but I wasn't. Whenever Maynard and I talked, and we talked a lot, it was about the work, I had no knowledge of. And frankly, I didn't have a lot of interest in the political aspect of the work. But then on the other hand, I don't know of many cabinet members that were involved in the political part, except Reginald Eves. Reginald was definitely one of those that attended the meeting before the meeting. But I was not really a insider in the administration. I enjoyed the work. I really, it was what I thought the work would be. I've learned a lot, though, since then. In those days, I graduated from Howard Law School, which has a certain, philosophy about the law that's a little unique. They taught us at Howard that the purpose of the law is not for you to get rich. The purpose of the law is for you to use the law to improve your community. And that had been the philosophy at Howard for many, many years, long before Thurgood Marshall graduated from there. So when we went into government, and I was one of the first groups to go into government out of, black community here in Atlanta, we were expecting that that's what we would be doing. We would be pushing the goal of equal opportunity under the law. We would be taking on, from where the movement was, we would take it on to another level. We learned very early, however, that it's not the same. There's no way. There's no way that government was. One of the statements Maynard made I did not agree with. He said at one point that the politics was a new civil rights movement. It wasn't. And it never will be. Because the civil rights movement was based on certain spiritual and moral principles. Government is based on power and money. So there's no way that it could ever be another movement. But in those days, what I started to say was, we were very excited because we were getting so many things done, to improve the entire community, not just the minority community. Because the more, it's interesting, the more progress we made on equal opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
You know, stronger Atlanta, the larger and the better and the stronger Atlanta, because, you know, people didn't consider Atlanta, you know, as anything except Dr. King's hometown, you know. But as the government and as the community it became more diverse and demonstrated fairness, we started having people coming in here from everywhere. You know, so I was really excited that what we were doing was not only benefiting, you know, our neighborhoods, but benefiting the entire town, because we pay taxes here, so we never separated ourselves from other folks. But I found out pretty soon, though, that, you know, government's a little different. It's a little different. You have these competing interests and groups that are without power, you know, at a real disadvantage, you know. So what helped us do what we were able to do, and I'd like to emphasize this over and over again, was not that we were so smart or so highly educated, you know, because this was not rocket science. We were able to do what we did because we had leaders who had not only the intellectual skills, but had the personal commitment and understanding about the meaning of justice in America. What it really meant in practical terms. That's why we were able to do it. You know, I appreciate all of naturally I'm encouraged by my name being listed from time to time with those who started affirmative action, but it was the folks really before us and who made the way. And when I say they made the way, I don't mean talking. I mean who did the sacrificing. You know, Grace Hamilton, for instance, you know, over that state, those people, they stood in spite of tremendous odds, you know, and said, no, we didn't come down here to take pictures or to cut ribbons. We came down here to get a job done. And you can get a lot done in government if you have one or two people like that. It doesn't take a whole lot, you know. So we did, and I'm very pleased that I happened to come along during this period in the 70s, you know, and 80s. It ended about mid-80s, about 1990, I would say. 70s and 80s, when it was really about using the resources of government to the public interest. I feel that was one of the real fortunate parts of my career. In 1992, I was elected to this position, and I often, I often joke and say I had a good reputation until then. I had a good reputation until I was elected to office. But I'm kind of joking about that. But I did find out, though, that external events over which we had no control, you know, social and economic, political events sort of changed all of that. But change is, you know, that's inevitable, and I would hope that we would make the necessary adjustments, but maintain our same goals, because we still have a lot of problems in this area. You know, we still haven't come a long way, but I see it every day. It's systemic. Yeah, it's systemic.
That sort of leads me to a question I'd like to hear you say a little more about.
Yes.
And that is, where are we now in sort of minority opportunity programs that the public sector is able to promote, and where do we need to be?
Yes. Well, that's kind of what I meant in my last statement, that the golden age of the 70s and 80s is over. We have made tremendous progress from that day when Mayor Jackson asked for a report on what is the real participation of minorities in this city, it was less than 1/2 of 1%. I'm not familiar with the numbers in Atlanta now, but certainly with Fulton County, it's more like 35, 36%, even though we don't have numerical goals. We have a non-discrimination policy. On some contracts, the goal may be 85%, I don't know, but we don't have goals. So we're certainly not less than 1/2 of 1% anymore. But considering past discrimination, considering the capacity of minority-owned firms now, who are not restricted to janitorial contracts in terms of their areas of expertise, I would say that we are definitely underperforming. I think that, because that's the way they measure it, these consultants. What's the number you have out there with the capacity to do it, and how many are participating? Those numbers are still don't look good. They don't look good. So that's why we continue here at Fulton County to give this area a very high priority.
Going back, Mayor Jackson, as I recall, very much a lightning rod for press criticism and the
Yes.
sort of stout opposition that you mentioned. How did you feel as the target for an awful lot of that criticism?
Well, I tell you, we felt as if, and I want to be accurate in my description of this. We were coming out of an era where we'd had many funerals. I went to government in 1970. Dr. King was killed in 78. Robert Kennedy right after him. We considered anything we were going through to be nothing in terms of the kind of traumatic shock that was on the community, which lasted for many years. People don't mention that too much about what the corporate impact was insofar as the community was concerned. So when we were involved in all this stuff, we'd been to funerals. And I considered it to be amusing. People had died. Children didn't have fathers. So I didn't. I will say though that I believe that it was a serious situation in the sense that it should be taken seriously. We felt that opposition to the ability of a person to get a job and feed their family because of the color of their skin was a serious matter. We didn't consider that, that's just the way it is. So we took it very seriously, but in terms of how we felt, I guess neither anger or fear. We felt like if these people would shoot somebody on a balcony, unarmed, what do you expect? Of course, now our kids and our grandkids, they have a different attitude. They can be frightened easily, particularly in my opinion, if it's some threat to their material, well-being. But we were a little different. I think it's just because of the times. The times were different. We weren't any different from them otherwise.
You brought up a name from your Hallowell and the work that he was doing at EEOC.
Yes.
Could you say a little more about his role in Atlanta in helping to bring equality of opportunity?
Yeah, there are a lot of pages about Mr. Hollowell, but he was the lawyer more than any other that led in the actions to desegregate institutions, the schools, and so on. He was also Dr. King's lawyer. When I say he was the Inc. Fund lawyer, I was referring to the Legal Defense Fund, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which means that he was assigned to cases throughout the South that many times involved death penalty cases. I know I worked with him on a case in Augusta where 4 teenagers had been charged with heinous crime, rape and murder, and the DA had asked for the death penalty. But he was an Inc. Fund lawyer, which means that he got a variety of cases all over the South that had to do with the defense of minorities, mostly blacks. Here in Atlanta, he was the key attorney on, as I said, desegregation cases and some other cases which you can check. At EEOC, these were great times for EEOC because the agency was new and it had a very strong commission in Washington. Clifford Alexander was chairman, and they wanted results. Originally, the jurisdiction of the agency was restricted to contractors who employ, with federal contracts, who employed more than 100 folks, which means that my investigation included Lockheed, Delta Airlines, Ford Motor Company, General Motors. These workers would come into our offices on Peachtree, 1776 Peachtree, file complaints alleging discrimination in hiring, in promotion, in working conditions, etc. And of course, under the law, we were required to determine, first of all, whether their allegations, they had sufficient facts to reach a finding of reasonable cause. And if we had a finding of reasonable cause, then we would go out and conduct masses. I was at Lockheed, Georgia, 6 weeks, just collecting, doing the investigation, you know. And of course, Georgia Power, 6 weeks. And of course, what you do in those particular cases is, what are the issues? Or whites being promoted who are less qualified than blacks. You know, and that's just a matter of record. You know, and so, but Hollowell, as a, and I don't like to say civil rights attorney because he actually, well, that's good enough, because if he, because he had other cases other than these, but as an Inc. Fund lawyer, NAACP Legal Defense Fund lawyer, one of his top priorities was handling those cases, and he had a fantastic firm. It included Horace Ward, retired federal judge, Howard Moore, who was a brilliant attorney, and William Alexander, who retired as a Superior Court judge. Outstanding. I worked mostly with Howard Moore and William Alexander when I was working in the firm. Learned a lot. I learned a big difference between what goes on in the classroom at Howard and what goes on in the courtroom. Big difference. But did I answer your question?
You did.
Yeah, it was a great experience working with Mr. Hollowell. Great experience.
He was someone I met when I came here in 1970.
Did you?
And
Yes.
I had an opportunity to interview him in
Yes.
that project.
Yes, I consider him one of my mentors. One of my mentors. He taught us, for me, one of the, and others who worked at his office. Vernon Jordan was in his office as a clerk as well, shortly before me, and others also worked there. And I think we all agree the thing about Mr. Hollowell was that not only about his skills in a courtroom and so on, but he could keep his eye on, he was focused. He wasn't distracted by all of the foolishness, you know. And that's, you know, it's just a matter of discipline in any field. You know, it's a matter of discipline. And when you're in this business, you know, of human rights and representing the public, you have to do that because there are so many distractions. You have to remember what it is that you're supposed to be about.
ask you a sort of overview summary. Your opinion has helped make Atlanta a different place than other cities. What's special about Atlanta?
That's a real easy one. It's our history. History. African American history, to be specific. African American history dominates. Their culture dominates the city, just like the Jewish culture dominates New York. A lot of cultures in New York, but I found out when I worked there, it's the Jewish culture that dominates New York. That's neither good nor bad, that's just a fact. That's true here. The way I sometimes respond to that question, they say, what's different about Atlanta? And I always say, the graves. It's different. And I do believe, I think Winston Churchill or somebody said, Winston Churchill had a statement on it too, but it was William Faulkner who said that the past is not dead, it's not even past. It's our past that makes us great. You know, not just men and women, but events. Events. I still think the phoenix is the best symbol, though. You know, rising from the ashes. I think that's what makes Atlanta different. I tell people all the time, I do a lot of speaking around, the country, and you get this a lot. What's different about Atlanta? A lot of cities have skyscrapers and good restaurants, and good music. But they're the intangible things. And I think what gives Atlanta its uniqueness, we love the food in New Orleans, but New Orleans can't compete with us. We have folks coming here from all over the world, and they sometimes don't even know why. But it's an intangible, something here that basically I think is spiritual. I think it's spiritual. And I believe that as long as we have it, we'll always be different, and we'll always be stronger, and we'll always survive. I don't want to be Denver. And we don't want to be Chicago or New York. No, we want to be what we are, because I think that our strength has always come from really our spirituality. That's why we're different. Don't want to be Charlotte either. Did everybody have their own culture and history? Because what makes a city great is not what it has. But let me quickly add, we are very proud of our growth. We're going to keep it up. In order for us to be strong, we have to be economically sound. We have to be environmentally safe. But we have to have justice. I tell people all the time, I'm proud of all of our cities in Fulton County. But when you go overseas, they don't ask you, are you from Johns Creek?
You said that's where you were.
Well, but interestingly, nobody says they're from Johns Creek unless they're over here.
Right.
Unless they're downstairs harassing us. But Atlanta, that's all we have. It's 1,000 cities have that skyline and better. It's not the skyline, not the Olympic, not the Falcons, not the aquarium, none of that. It's that grave down there on Auburn. That's what it is, and what it represents. Y'all, I have a 4:30.
Okay.
Can I answer any other wrap-up question?
Ooh, it's not a wrap-up question, but you wrap things up so well that I think I should be finished.
Are you sure?
Well, I want to ask about, since you are dealing with equal opportunity, I wonder how it worked out with women.
I would say that everything that I have said with respect to minorities, it applies to women as well.
Okay.
It's been a little interesting in development, though, here in the last 10 or 12 years. Some governments have permitted companies to substitute women for minorities or to count women as minorities as we try to reach our goals. And what we have to say is, no, we have a standard for equal opportunity for women, equal opportunity for minorities. We're not going to count but one time, you know. And in our evaluation of how we're doing with respect to women and eradicating gender discrimination, we have the same policies, the same procedures, identical. And we believe that we have to be very careful because companies have said, you know, we recently had a major company, we asked for the subcontractor report, and minority subcontractors had not received work, but the female contractors had, and they wanted to use one for the other. So no, let's do them separately. So we take them separately. Yeah, but it's identical, no difference. I'm glad you asked that. That was a good question. Oh yes. But I always say that's the best generation coming along.
It's a good little
That's the
group.
best one. Yes.
Well,
I thank you
very,
all.
very much.
I was reminded that I did have a 4:30 that I had moved, but I had originally set aside longer, but I had moved. We have a board meeting tomorrow, and I have some people who want to see me before.
I understand. Well, we really appreciate your,
Well, I enjoyed meeting you all. It's a very important project, and
well, we
I look forward
appreciate it, and
to-
we didn't, every time my dad kept saying, have you talked to Emma Darnell?
oh, he's one of my favorite
And
folks.
he wanted to make,
He understands. He's a Pisces.
Are you a Pisces too? Oh, Lord. Well,
Say no more.
say no more. Say no more.